Arlington National Cemetery in Virginia. In a news briefing this week, John F. Kelly, the White House Chief of Staff, described walking among the graves. Lexey Swall for the New York Times, Washington, when John F. Kelly stood in the White House briefing room on Thursday and described how the remains of American troops killed in combat are shipped home and then called on only reporters who knew families of dead service members, he held to an underlying theme: the military is an elite class separated from the American people by its infallible values. To some veterans, it was a genuine statement to a public with little understanding of the violence and loss of war. To others, Mr. Kelly, President Trump's chief of staff, only expanded the ever-growing gulf between the United States all-volunteer military and the public it serves. It was a microcosm of the divide, said Philip Carter, an Iraq War veteran and a senior fellow at the Center for a New American Security. He both craves to be understood by society but also holds the military above and apart from society. Mr. Kelly, a retired Marine general, lost his son, 2nd Lt. Robert Kelly, also a Marine, to a landmine in 2010 in Afghanistan. He has repeatedly stressed that less than 1% of Americans are serving on active duty, a statistic that service members often point to when explaining the rift between themselves and their civilian counterparts. Although he has rarely spoken about his son's death publicly, Mr. Kelly told reporters on Thursday what happened when his friend Gen. Joseph F. Dunford Jr., now the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff but in late 2010 was the assistant commandant of the Marine Corps, broke the news to Mr. Kelly of his son's death. A mother and son mourning at Arlington National Cemetery on Memorial Day this year. Chip's emotive elaborate images, he said. "Cal, he was doing exactly what he wanted to do when he was killed," Mr. Kelly recalled. "He knew what he was getting into by joining that 1%. He knew what the possibilities were because we're at war." Mr. Kelly used General Dunford's words to try to explain why Mr. Trump told the widow of an American soldier killed in Niger this month that the soldier knew what he signed up for. After his remarks, Mr. Kelly permitted only those reporters who knew families of dead service members, called Gold Star families, to ask questions. Phil Clay, a Marine veteran and the author of Redeployment, a collection of short stories about the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, said he had little problem with most of Mr. Kelly's remarks but took umbrage at his restrictions on the questioning. "If the problem is that most Americans aren't engaged, then saying that only those who are engaged can ask about this, then that is deeply counterproductive," Mr. Clay said in an interview. "This is deeply critical to us as a nation, and war is a huge part of what this country does. It is common for veterans to return from Iraq and Afghanistan to a United States largely unaware of the wars they have just finished fighting. College classes can be awkward, and questions at Thanksgiving about what happened on the battlefield are hard to answer." At the peak of the Iraq War, a picture of a dry erase board spread widely among the military, a rallying cry of sorts for those who prided themselves on being the United States warrior caste. The board contained 3 lines: "America is not at war. The Marine Corps is at war. America is at them all." In a speech in St. Louis in 2010, after his son was killed, Mr. Kelly said something similar: "America as a whole is certainly not at war. Not as a country, not as a people. Today, only a tiny fraction, less than 1%, shoulder the burden of fear and sacrifice, and they shoulder it for the rest of us. The small number of active duty troops is not a failing but a policy decision based on the size of the force required to defend the country," said Corey Shake, a former national security aide to President George W. Bush and a defense policy expert at Stanford University's Hoover Institution. Mr. Kelly's remarks, she said, invoked a sense of pity for those who have not served in the military, but were dangerous because they did not seem to place value on other forms of public service. On the one hand, he spoke with enormous moral clarity about the horrible burden Gold Star families experience and how that burden is very far removed from most Americans when we have such a small volunteer force, Ms. Shake said. At the same time, he did widen the civilian-military gap. For J.R. Salzman, who was serving as a sergeant in the Minnesota National Guard in 2006 when he lost his right arm below the elbow to an Iranian-made roadside bomb, the entire controversy was overblown. "I don't see any winners on either side of it," Mr. Salzman said in an interview. "I think the whole thing needs to get put to bed," Mr. Salzman, who vividly remembers how protesters gathered outside every Friday while he was healing at Walter Reed Army Medical Center, said that the civilian-military divide is growing and that he does not expect it to close anytime soon. "My arm is gone, and it's not growing back," Mr. Salzman said. "People will give you the whole pat on the back and the thank you for your service, but it doesn't go beyond that. Because they don't understand." A version of this article appears in print on October 21, 2017, on page A15 of the New York edition with the headline "Personal account also shows a gulf between the military and civilians."